This next problem involves conversion factors from a percent. On a bottle of rubbing alcohol, you may notice that it says 70% of whatever the active ingredient is. In this, if we're rubbing alcohol, it is 70% by volume of isopropanol. Okay. So what does this percentage mean? The percent always means per 100. Remember, centi means 100. Another way to think about it is like a century. How many years are in a century? 100 years are in a century. So anytime that we are talking about percents, we're always talking about per 100. So when we say 70% by volume isopropanol, this is telling us the percentage of the volume of rubbing alcohol per 100 milliliters of the rubbing alcohol. So 70% of the rubbing alcohol is isopropanol. So what does that mean? When we say by volume, we're going to need to recognize that that's going to give us our units of volume, and we're going to use our units of volume in milliliters in this case. Okay, you're always going to just follow along with whatever units are provided in the problem. In this problem, we will be working with milliliters as our volume. But if a different volume unit is used, you will use that volume unit. Okay. So 70% by volume isopropanol is in the rubbing alcohol. This means 70.0 milliliters of isopropanol per over. So whenever we're saying per, that means that we're going to write it in fraction form, per 100 milliliters of our rubbing alcohol. Okay, so for every 100 milliliters of rubbing alcohol, it contains 70 milliliters of the active ingredient isopropanol. Okay. So now let's say we look at our problem. Our problem says, calculate the volume of isopropanol in 50 milliliters of rubbing alcohol. Okay, so of course, given that we have 100 milliliters here, you might be able to do this in your head, but we're going to show how we can apply this as a conversion factor in order to convert the amount of rubbing alcohol. So let's write this down first before I get too far ahead of myself. Calculate the volume of the isopropanol. I'm just going to abbreviate it right now. In milliliters, in 50, with a decimal at the end. We're going to talk about, remind ourselves what that means, milliliters of rubbing alcohol. That's the problem we're going to do now. So the problem here is a word problem. You need to recognize what is the given value in this problem. The given value states that we have 50 milliliters of rubbing alcohol. The question is asking us the volume of isopropanol within that quantity of rubbing alcohol. So our question is converting 50 milliliters of rubbing alcohol to milliliters of isopropanol. Okay, so that's our plan. So let's begin. Okay, so we have 50 milliliters of rubbing alcohol. looking at what we have written here from the percentage, we can treat this like a conversion factor. What we have is the isopropanol in the numerator and the rubbing alcohol in the denominator. In the problem here, we have rubbing alcohol in the numerator, which we want to change to isopropanol. Okay, so what we need is to recognize that we're going to keep this fraction as is. We don't need to flip it because it already has our units of rubbing alcohol on the bottom in order to cancel diagonally. So we're going to put 100 milliliters of our rubbing alcohol on the bottom. And then we're going to put our 70 milliliters of isopropanol on top. 70.0. So the rubbing alcohol and the isopropanol is part of the units. So that's why I am writing it down in the conversion factor, because it's keeping track of what it is that we are converting. We're converting from volume of the rubbing alcohol to the amount of volume of the isopropanol within the rubbing alcohol. Okay. So remember, this is chemistry, so we're working with matter, we're working with different substances, and we need to recognize what it is that we are converting between and what the meaning is behind the calculations that we're doing. So now that we have this set up, we recognize that we canceled our units of rubbing alcohol. We now have milliliters of isopropanol, which is what we wanted to convert to. Calculate the volume of isopropanol. So once you have this, now you begin your calculation. 50 times 70 divided by 100. So we multiply the numerators, divide the denominator. And what you should be getting is 35 milliliters of isopropanol. Okay. Now, just as a reminder of significant figures, this number has been written with a decimal at the end after the 0. That decimal is placed there in order to indicate that this 0 is significant. So therefore, this value has 2 significant figures. Okay. This value has 3 significant figures. Okay. This 0 and this 0 are both significant because this 0 comes before a decimal and after a non-zero, and this 0 comes after a decimal and after a non-zero. Okay, so any zeros that come after a non-zero will be significant as long as a decimal is in place. Then what we recognize is that if this is 2 significant figures and this is 3 significant figures, the least number of significant figures is 2. So our final answer of 35 is correct in our significant figures. 100 in the percentage is going to act as an exact number.